When Alvaro Uribe stepped down as president of Colombia in 2010, the Financial Times ran an article entitled, "After the Savior, What Happens Next?" Uribe, whose scandal-ridden presidency led to human rights abuses soaring, was portrayed by the press as the hero of the nation, the man who had finally made Colombia safe. A feel-good factor flourished alongside this return of confidence in Colombia's growing economy, gushed the FT. The press implied that any remaining violence was the result of criminals and outlaws who were fighting over cocaine. And so it is that Colombia is now portrayed as a country on the up, with rising GDP and tourism posters that tell us the only risk is wanting to stay. This is our journey into the international media and its relationship with a very complicated country. For the best part of 50 years, the Colombian state has been locked in a civil war with the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, a Marxist peasant insurgency known as the FARC. They have been trying to push back on the government's neoliberal and colonialist economic policies. It's true that the FARC has committed serious human rights violations, but the FARC is not the root cause of violence in Colombia. The roots of the conflict lie in land distribution. Colombia has some of the most unequal land distribution on earth, and peasants are regularly forced off the land by state forces and far-right paramilitary groups to make way for transnational mining projects. Activists who try to organise local people to resist are at high risk of assassination by far-right paramilitaries. In 2008, President Uribe said that he had demobilised all the far-right paramilitary groups that are responsible for most of the violence in Colombia. It was a move praised by the White House in the Washington Post as the power, determination and progress of what is happening in Colombia. But Amnesty International says the demobilisation was inadequate, and Human Rights Watch found strong links between state forces and paramilitary groups as recently as 2012. When I went to Colombia in 2013, I met peasants who told me state security forces are just paramilitaries wearing a different uniform. But inconveniently for the US, the UK and parts of Western Europe, Colombia also happens to be a very resource-rich country, which is really good for business. In 2012, Obama put the US-Colombia Free Trade Agreement into force. He described it as a win-win, which is funny because before he became president, he refused to support it on the grounds of the country's terrible human rights record. This is where the role of the international press comes in. Governments need a way of justifying the fact that they trade with and give financial aid to the country with the worst human rights record in the Western Hemisphere. The press helps them with that by totally misrepresenting the political situation in Colombia. It's not a shady conspiracy contrived by journalists and politicians in smoky rooms, so much as it is evidence of the fact that the press can be rather supine when it comes to Colombia and often regurgitates their government stance unquestioningly. When Uribe was president, governments found it harder to justify an alliance with Colombia. He was very efficient when it came to cracking down on the FARC, but he was also quite an embarrassing ally because he had alleged links to violent far-right paramilitaries, and his highly militaristic policies brought about a number of egregious human rights scandals. Helpfully, the press portrayed Uribe as a force for good in Colombia because he was so militaristic in his approach towards the FARC. The BBC said, "President Alvaro Uribe may go down as one of Colombia's greatest presidents, with his policies for tackling guerrillas and drug traffickers now a permanent fixture in the country." But positive coverage wasn't enough to disguise the human rights abuses from NGOs, the global left and progressive politicians who put a lot of pressure on their governments about their relationships with Colombia. When Uribe stepped down, he was replaced by Juan Manuel Santos. Despite the fact that Santos was Uribe's protégé, he almost immediately portrayed himself in the press as an advocate for peace and equality. This was lapped up by press such as the New York Times, which interviewed him in 2011, talking about his Harvard education, implying he is an intellectual, and quoting him as saying, If in 4 years they're going to call me the small Roosevelt of Colombia, then I would be honored. Unlike Uribe, Santos agreed to peace talks with the FARC, which further cemented his reputation as a peacemaker who was leading Colombia in a new and better direction. Most media outlets talked about his hopes for peace. The peace talks are extremely important, but little is said about the fact that they have not reduced Colombia's social repression, like the assassination of activists, the repression of dissent, or the displacement of peasants for the benefit of transnational companies. Furthermore, the peace talks have allowed the press to suggest that violence in Colombia is over. First, Uribe weakened the FARC, goes the narrative, then came Santos with peace. This narrative made the US-Colombia Free Trade Agreement politically possible, as well as the EU-Colombia Free Trade Agreement. The truth is, activists were threatened with more violence after the peace talks started, and Amnesty International notes that human rights abuses continue. But the majority of articles don't mention this. This omission means that the government isn't pressured to stop social repression or stop military activity against the FARC while the peace process is underway. Instead, the press heaps all the responsibility onto the FARC to make peace talks work. Clock is ticking on the FARC to make peace, declared The Independent. Very little emphasis is given to the political context behind the presence of the FARC and other guerrilla groups in Colombia. The FARC is a product of Colombia's social repression and vast inequality. But a lot of the reporting on Colombian politics suggests the FARC are nothing more than cocaine dealers. As Bloomberg reports, the new drug revenue has helped the FARC, which morphed from a Marxist peasant insurgency into the world's biggest cocaine producer. Of course, nobody should let the FARC get away with committing human rights abuses against civilians, like the kidnapping of civilians. But if we're not honest about why the FARC exists, there will never be stable peace in Colombia. So, let's summarize the popular impression of Colombia as a result of press coverage. The last 5 or 10 years have seen the dawn of a new, peaceful, prosperous Colombia, or a rediscovered country, as the FT puts it. The civil war, which is mainly about cocaine, will come to an end as long as the FARC behave themselves. There aren't paramilitaries anymore, but criminal gangs, who are just gangsters interested in drugs, as opposed to far-right, politically motivated mercenaries. Look at the way The Telegraph reported the arrest of one of Colombia's chief paramilitaries. Colombia extradites top drug gang leader to United States. The cumulative effect of this impression is to depoliticize Colombia's violence for readers. When we hear someone has been killed in Colombia, like Hamilton Andres Avila's assassination in a school in the municipality of Yondo, our natural reaction is to assume it was a turf war over drugs. We don't assume a community leader has been murdered by a far-right group for organising his community around land rights. We don't think, oh, that must be to do with the government's reliance on oil and mining industries pushing peasants off the land, because you just don't learn about that stuff when you read about Colombia as a casual observer. Depoliticizing the violence means we are also less inclined to pay attention to Colombia's record of suppressing protest. Here, it is useful to compare the depiction of Colombia to Venezuela. In August 2013, Colombian farmers launched a large-scale demonstration in opposition to Colombian trade policies that are strongly supported by the UK and US governments. The think tank CEPR compared the coverage of these protests to protests in Venezuela a year later and found that Venezuela's protests were given at least twice the coverage of those in Colombia. In the New York Times, Venezuela's protests received 9 times more coverage than Colombia's. USA Today did not cover Colombia at all. When Colombia's protests were covered, the media focused on the government's accusation that protests had been infiltrated by the FARC, like Reuters, which led with the headline, "Colombia's farm protest has been infiltrated by FARC, government says." When Venezuela's protests were covered, protesters were not scrutinized at all, even though there was evidence of widespread violence like the beheading of a pro-government activist. Instead, the coverage almost exclusively focused upon repressive behaviour of the security forces, leading to lists of heartbreaking images like this one from BuzzFeed. This enormously skewed reporting lets the Colombian government off the hook. And that's bad, because the greatest victims of state and paramilitary violence in Colombia are the urban poor and peasants. State forces commit a lot of violence in Colombia, which goes largely unpunished, and the country's jail is currently holding over 2,000 political prisoners charged with rebellion. Some of those are held for years without trial. Skewed press coverage also means the government isn't under pressure to address Colombia's enormous problems with internal displacement and massive inequality. We need to scrutinise press coverage of Colombia and demand better from the country's government. If we don't, human rights abuses will continue, people will lose their homes, innocent people will be locked up, and criminals will be allowed to get away with murder.